Imagine a royal coronation, trumpets blaring, nobles watching in awe. Now picture the queen-to-be lying naked, pale and trembling, her body covered in leeches, bleeding from a dozen tiny wounds. This wasn't a horror ritual. This was medicine. And to them, it made perfect sense. But who was this queen? Why was she crowned in such a disturbing state? And what does this reveal about the brutal beliefs and cruel rituals that ruled the lives of even the most powerful women in medieval Europe? Because sometimes the crown didn't just weigh heavy, it bled. The cathedral was cold that morning, not just from the stone walls or the chill in the early dawn air, but from the tension. Every eye was fixed on the procession. The banners hung limp, incense curled through the rafters. The queen-to-be had not yet appeared. And then, a hush. She emerged slowly, pale, silent, regal, but something was wrong. Her gown was thin, too thin, and her face, though powdered, was ghastly white. The hem of her dress was stained red, and beneath the veil, small trickles of blood ran from her arms, her legs, her neck. Attendants had done their best to hide it, but whispers spread quickly among the crowd. Leeches. Earlier that morning, the queen had undergone a ritual bloodletting. Dozens of leeches applied to her body to drain bad humours and purify her soul before receiving the divine rite of monarchy. According to her physicians, she was spiritually cleansed and properly balanced for coronation. In reality, she was weak, lightheaded, barely able to stand upright under the weight of the crown. But why? To modernize, this is madness. But in medieval Europe, medicine wasn't medicine. It was a strange cocktail of superstition, religion, and Galenic theory. The body, they believed, was governed by 4 humours: blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. Illness, emotional instability, even moral corruption were all signs these fluids had fallen out of balance. Bloodletting, often with knives, but more symbolically with leeches, was one of the most revered practices, especially for royalty, because a monarch wasn't just a ruler, they were a symbol of cosmic order. If their body was corrupted, it could throw the whole kingdom into chaos. So, on the morning of her coronation, this queen was not simply being treated. She was being sacrificed, in a way, offering her suffering to the divine. A bleeding queen, trembling beneath her crown. And this was only the beginning. She tried to hide the wince as the bishop anointed her forehead with holy oil. The gesture was supposed to bless her rule, to mark her as chosen by God. But the open leech wounds beneath her ceremonial collar throbbed with every heartbeat. Her breath came shallow. Behind the scenes, a maid had slipped her a bit of wine laced with crushed herbs to keep her steady. No one could afford a fainting queen, not today. Outside, the crowd cheered. Inside the cathedral, however, the clergy were nervously exchanging glances. Because this queen wasn't just any queen. She was foreign-born, newly married, and her loyalty to the realm was still under suspicion. There were rumours of witchcraft in her homeland. Her marriage had been a political solution, not a romantic one. So every gesture in this ceremony had to prove something. Her purity, her obedience, her submission to the traditions of the crown. And nothing demonstrated humility in the medieval mindset quite like physical suffering. Leeches weren't just medical tools, they were symbols. They drew blood, yes, but they also drained pride, sin, and suspicion. For a noblewoman, especially one entering power, undergoing bloodletting before a public appearance sent a powerful message. I am willing to suffer. I am willing to be made pure. I accept this burden. It was performance, plain and simple, but with very real pain. Historians believe the ritual may have been pushed by both her physicians and her political advisors, perhaps even encouraged by the church. After all, a queen's body was never really her own. It was a vessel for heirs, a symbol of the throne, a walking testament to her husband's power. If she bled in silence, if she bore it with grace, then maybe, just maybe, the nobles would accept her. Maybe the peasants would bless her. Maybe God would too. But the truth was more chilling. That morning, this woman wasn't just becoming a queen. She was being reshaped by blood, pain, and fear into something else entirely. By the time the crown was placed on her head, her vision was blurring. The pain from the leech bites, small but persistent, had become a dull roar in the back of her skull. She kept her spine straight, her mouth closed, her expression composed. A queen must not flinch, but inside, her body was screaming. It's easy to forget now how dangerous these rituals could be. Bloodletting was not only excruciating, it was deadly when done excessively. Some physicians, in their desperation to purge an imbalanced patient, bled them into shock or infection. And queens, though draped in silk and power, were not immune to medical malpractice dressed as tradition. After the ceremony, she was carried to her chambers, not because it was custom, but because she could barely walk. Attendants wiped the dried blood from her skin. The royal physician declared her noble humours renewed. Priests praised her piety. Nobles whispered admiration for her strength. But behind closed doors, she collapsed. This was not an isolated case. Throughout medieval Europe, royal women were subjected to extreme forms of preparation before major events, purgatives before weddings, fumigations before childbirth, fasting and bleeding before coronations. These rituals had layers, spiritual, political, and deeply gendered. For men, kingship was often about dominance. For women, queenship was about suffering. And so, the image of this queen, crowned in front of thousands while secretly bleeding beneath her robes, becomes more than a strange anecdote. It becomes a symbol of the era, when science bowed to superstition, when pain was mistaken for purity, and when even the most powerful women had to bleed to be believed. The leeches may have fallen off, the wounds may have healed, but the memory of that coronation, of that brutal initiation, would haunt her for years. It was the day she ascended the throne, and the day a part of her vanished forever beneath it. You'd think the palace would be the safest place in the world to fall ill, surrounded by gold, guarded by knights, and advised by the most learned men of the time. Surely the king or queen would get the best medical care possible. Right? Wrong. In medieval Europe, being treated by a royal physician often meant submitting to rituals that were as painful as they were pointless. And sometimes, those treatments killed faster than the disease ever could. Let's start with the basics. Medieval medicine wasn't medicine in the modern sense. It was a confusing mashup of ancient Greek theories, Christian theology, astrology, and plain guesswork. Doctors, if you could call them that, relied heavily on Galen's four-humour theory. According to him, health was all about balance. Too much blood, you were hot and impulsive. Too much black bile, you were melancholic. And the cure for imbalance? Purge, bleed, burn, repeat. Royal courts were especially obsessed with maintaining this so-called balance. After all, if the monarch was divinely chosen, then his or her body had to reflect cosmic order. Any sickness, even a headache, was seen as a spiritual warning or moral failure. So treatments weren't just about healing, they were about restoring divine favor. Take bloodletting, for example. It wasn't reserved for emergencies, it was done seasonally. Spring was the most popular time to bleed. Some kings underwent bloodletting every few weeks to cleanse the soul. One English monarch reportedly passed out during a banquet because he'd been bled earlier that morning, and no one thought to cancel the feast. And this wasn't just done with leeches. Doctors used knives, lancets, and even heated cups. Veins were opened, blood drained, and the patient was often left weaker than before. But that weakness? That was seen as a sign the treatment had worked. In other words, the more you suffered, the closer you were to being cured. And if that sounds cruel, just wait until you hear what they did next. If bleeding didn't help, or more likely made things worse, medieval doctors had plenty more tools in their deadly toolkit. One of the most shocking? Trepanning. This was the practice of drilling a hole directly into a person's skull. The goal? To release pressure, let out evil spirits, or relieve madness. In reality, it was a one-way ticket to infection, brain trauma, or death. Yet kings, nobles, and commoners alike submitted to it, and desperate for relief from headaches or seizures, which they often believed were caused by sin, not science. And then there were the urine inspections. Physicians would swirl, smell, and sometimes even taste a patient's urine to determine their health. Charts were made, comparing shades of yellow and brown to diagnose everything from lovesickness to liver rot. It sounds absurd today, but at the time, it was considered state-of-the-art. For the wealthy, treatments could become even more extreme. Mercury was used to treat skin diseases and cleanse impurities, especially among royalty. Yes, mercury, the toxic metal that slowly eats away at your organs and brain. Several rulers, including King Charles II of England, were administered mercury vapor in attempts to extend their lives. Spoiler: it didn't work. But perhaps nothing reflects the dark absurdity of medieval medicine more than the use of human body parts as cures. Mummified flesh, ground skulls, and even blood were prescribed as medicines, especially the blood of executed criminals. It was believed that consuming the vitality of someone recently dead could give the sick a final chance at recovery. In short, medicine and mysticism were inseparable. Illness wasn't just a physical ailment, it was divine punishment, bad astrology, or the devil's touch. And the treatments? They were often more symbolic than scientific. Pain wasn't just accepted, it was expected. Because if it didn't hurt, how could it possibly be healing you? And in the royal courts, where appearances mattered more than outcomes, that question became lethal. For royal women, medical treatment was often indistinguishable from punishment. Their bodies were constantly scrutinized, not just for illness, but for signs of fertility, moral purity, and political usefulness. And in a world where a queen's primary role was to produce heirs, any perceived imbalance was met with invasive, often dangerous, corrections. Take the case of enemas. Yes, highborn women were routinely given herbal enemas to clear the womb or restore balance. Administered by servants or court doctors, these rituals were sometimes scheduled days before marriage, childbirth, or royal appearances. One noblewoman reportedly endured 6 enemas in 2 days before her wedding, to ensure clean virtue and smooth conception. Then there was fumigation, a treatment where women sat over steaming cauldrons of herbs, vinegar, and sometimes burning sulfur. The vapor was meant to cleanse the womb or lure a displaced uterus back into place, because yes, medieval medicine believed the womb could wander around the body, causing hysteria. Imagine the humiliation, the burns, the pain, all justified in the name of science. And don't forget vaginal bleeding rituals. When menstruation stopped due to stress or illness, queens were often cut or leeched to reopen the flow, under the belief that trapped blood led to madness. It was brutal, and it was common. None of this happened behind closed doors either. Royal treatments were public affairs, discussed at court, debated by male physicians, approved by bishops. The patient, the queen, rarely had a say. Her body was a tool of the state. Her pain, a necessary cost of political order. That's what makes these stories so disturbing. These weren't fringe cases. These were the best that medicine had to offer, the elite, the trusted, the chosen few with access to power. And still, their treatment was a blend of theatre and torment. So if a queen could be bled, burned, and broken in the name of health, what hope did anyone else have? There's a brutal truth buried in the history of queenship. The crown was never just placed on a woman's head, it was carved into her flesh. In the medieval world, a queen wasn't merely a ruler's wife. She was a vessel, a symbol, a breathing, bleeding emblem of divine femininity, expected to be pious, fertile, obedient, and silent. And if she failed in any of those roles, the punishment wasn't exile. It was ritualized suffering disguised as duty. Power for royal women came at a cost, and the price was usually pain. From the moment a noblewoman was promised in marriage, her body became state property. Her diet, her movements, even her bodily functions were managed. If she wept too much, she was hysterical. If she didn't bleed monthly, she was cursed. If she spoke out of turn, she was unnatural. The only acceptable expression of power for a queen was suffering, gracefully. This is why so many of the medical rituals inflicted on royal women were invasive, humiliating, and cruel. Bloodletting wasn't just about humours, it was about control. Enemas weren't just medicinal, they were cleansing rites. The queen's pain wasn't incidental, it was necessary to legitimize her position. And society believed it, wholeheartedly. Theologians taught that women were descendants of Eve, born with original sin in their very blood. Pain, especially during childbirth or menstruation, was seen as penance. In fact, some believed that a queen's womb was the battlefield where sin met salvation, and that any suffering she endured would benefit the entire realm. So when a queen stood on the coronation platform, her skin still raw from leeches, her gut emptied by herbs, and her soul trembling from fear, she wasn't just being crowned, she was being remade, sanctified, sacrificed, and no one around her questioned it, because to them this was tradition. To her, it was the beginning of a gilded prison. What's most disturbing is how pain wasn't just accepted, it was ritualized. Take the example of Queen Isabella of France, who was forced to endure a brutal series of purgative treatments after being accused, falsely, of being too barren for her husband. Her male advisors ordered bleeding, starvation, and prayer-induced fasting, not because she was sick, but because she wasn't conceiving fast enough. When her health collapsed, she was blamed for being weak of spirit. Royal women existed in a paradox. They were supposed to be pure, soft, and submissive, but also fertile, enduring, and politically shrewd. And when those identities clashed, medicine was weaponized to correct them. Female bodies became the battleground where superstition, science, and misogyny collided. Even pregnancy wasn't a safe harbor. Queens were often subjected to violent remedies to induce labor on time. Midwives used herbal infusions, steam baths, and sometimes inserted sharpened objects to rupture membranes early. If the child was late, the mother was punished with stronger treatments. If the child was stillborn, the mother was blamed for having dark thoughts or bad blood. Behind all this cruelty was a chilling belief: the queen must suffer so the kingdom may thrive. And while kings were certainly exposed to medieval medicine's horrors, their bodies were never as politicized, sexualized, or scrutinized. A king's sickness might be whispered about. A queen's was a public crisis: her womb, her cycles, her blood, all fodder for court intrigue. And yet, many of these women endured. Some even used their suffering as a kind of silent rebellion, performing the rituals with stoicism, mastering court etiquette, and surviving systems designed to crush them. But at what cost? They emerged not as individuals, but as instruments of power, decorated, adored, and constantly bleeding beneath the jewels. Some queens resisted quietly, others fought more openly, but nearly all of them, from England to France to the Holy Roman Empire, were forced to navigate a system where a woman's suffering was proof of her legitimacy. And the more visibly she bled, broke, or bowed, the more worthy she was deemed of the crown. Take Queen Jadwiga of Poland. She was only crowned at age 10, not as queen consort, but as king, in an effort to legitimize her reign. As she grew older, her advisors subjected her to intense fasting, religious flagellation, and what they called soul purification treatments, rituals that often left her faint and ill. She accepted it all in silence. Her suffering, they said, made her a saint. Or consider Anne of Austria, the Queen of France. When she failed to produce an heir for over 20 years, her body became a spectacle. Physicians performed repeated bleedings, purgations, and even insisted on abstinence during key lunar phases to correct her fertility. The court gossiped that her womb was cursed. Her eventual pregnancy was seen not as triumph, but as proof the torture had worked. And then there were the anonymous ones: the duchesses, the noble brides, the foreign princesses married off to unfamiliar kings. Their names rarely appear in textbooks, but their stories echo in palace records, old medical texts, and letters. Girls subjected to brutal cleansing rituals before wedding nights. Women forced to undergo examinations to prove virginity. Queens bled to weakness before childbirth because a drained womb is an obedient one. Their pain was never incidental. It was policy, it was prophecy, it was power bent into the shape of a woman and polished until no one could see the scars underneath. When we remember these queens, we often focus on their crowns, their portraits, their scandals. But behind the velvet and the gold was always something darker, a body shaped by ritual pain and public sacrifice. A body no one called hers. The crown was never just a symbol of power. In many ways, it was a curse. To wear it meant sacrificing autonomy, not just of decisions, but of the body, the soul, the very self. And that legacy of royal suffering didn't fade with the Middle Ages. It morphed, adapted, and survived in new forms. The rituals became less bloody, but no less brutal. Consider the case of Empress Elizabeth of Austria, Sisi, as she was called. In the 19th century, long after the era of leeches and fumigations had passed, Sisi endured a different kind of pain: forced beauty regimens, starvation diets, isolation, and invasive fertility monitoring. Her waist was famously only 19 inches, maintained through corsets so tight she sometimes fainted during state events. Her entire life was regimented around appearances. She lived in a palace but never felt free. Or Queen Victoria, who wore black for 40 years after her husband's death, not only out of grief, but to adhere to strict codes of royal mourning. Even in her most private moments, her emotions were scripted by royal protocol. When she suffered from postpartum depression, doctors told her it was hysteria of the womb and prescribed silence and solitude. And while public bleeding ceremonies may have ended, the fascination with royal pain did not. From tabloids to gossip columns to online forums, the world has always loved watching queens suffer. Whether it's through medical horror, emotional breakdowns, or scandalous betrayals, pain remains the currency of royal storytelling. A beautiful queen in agony still captivates, not because we admire her strength, but because her misery feels like theatre. It's a legacy rooted in centuries of blood, leeches, and blind obedience. Because when pain becomes tradition, we stop seeing it for what it truly is: cruelty disguised as culture. And when a crown sits on a woman's head, we rarely ask what it cost her to wear it, but we should. If there's one thing history shows us, it's this: suffering was never incidental to royalty, especially for women. It was woven into the job description. And over time, that suffering became sanctified. In the late medieval period, saints and queens began to blur in the public imagination. A queen who endured miscarriages, death, betrayal, or physical pain without complaint was likened to the Virgin Mary. Endurance became holiness. Silence became virtue. A bleeding queen wasn't just enduring hardship. She was embodying the nation's pain, cleansing it through her own suffering. Take the case of Queen Jeanne III of Navarre, who was lauded for remaining devout and composed while enduring the slow death of syphilis, a disease she likely contracted through a political marriage. Physicians offered mercury treatments, cupping, cauterization, all agonizing. And when she died, it wasn't her suffering that horrified the court, but her moments of complaint. It was said she failed to suffer with grace at the end. That was the true scandal. This warped idea that a queen's dignity came from her ability to suffer quietly created a generational curse. Queens were expected to be flawless but fragile, powerful but submissive. If they showed too much will, they were unnatural. If they collapsed from pain, they were weak. Even in modern monarchies, echoes remain. Diana, Princess of Wales, was relentlessly hounded for her vulnerability. Her struggles with mental health, eating disorders, and emotional turmoil were publicized, picked apart, and painted as personal failings, not symptoms of the impossible expectations placed upon her. We watched her bleed in the tabloids, just as medieval peasants watched queens bleed in cathedrals. Different tools, same cruelty. And while we might think we've come a long way from leeches and humoral theory, the truth is, many of the same dynamics still persist. Only now we've traded bloodletting bowls for camera lenses. And still, the Queen is expected to smile. So what does it all mean? this long, painful lineage of crowned suffering. It means that behind every story of royal opulence, there is often a mirror image of ritualized pain. For queens especially, power was never handed over freely. It was negotiated through the body, through silence, through sacrifice, and too often through blood. That queen who was crowned while covered in leeches. She wasn't a historical anomaly. She was a symptom of a much larger system, one that sanctified pain, disguised control as ceremony, and used medicine as a mask for submission. And that system didn't disappear when we stopped bleeding queens with leeches. It evolved. Today, we celebrate royal women for their poise, their grace under pressure, their ability to keep calm and carry on. But rarely do we ask what they're carrying or how long they have had to endure it. We praise their composure while ignoring the centuries-long inheritance of emotional suppression and bodily regulation that comes with their roles. Think of the coronation robes, the rehearsed smiles, the endless scrutiny. Even now, the image of a perfect queen remains one of elegant restraint, a woman who bears it all without breaking. But history tells a darker story. For centuries, queens were not just crowned, they were bled, bound, burned, and blamed. Their bodies were not just symbols of the state, they were laboratories for medical cruelty, vessels for political anxieties, and objects of religious obsession. And if we're still drawn to those stories today, if the idea of a queen bleeding beneath her crown fascinates us, then maybe we haven't moved on as much as we think, because sometimes the rituals change, but the suffering stays the same.